The concerns raised in the submission about the capacity of appointees included the lack of basic office-based employment skills possessed by some members of the tribunal, such as the ability to type, save a document to Microsoft Word, or access resources on the internet, the lack of legal skills of some members and the time wasted in having to repeatedly assist them, the poor attitude of some members towards their role, and the lack of interest in ensuring the hearings are conducted in a procedurally fair manner. It just goes on.
Have one for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
Dead, buried, cremated.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
The Treasurer knows.
Australia's basically done for. We'll just end up being a third-rate economy. You know, a banana republic.
How good is Australia?
Just follow the money.
G'day, and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains big economic issues in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and today we're going to talk about some new research from the Institute showing that the number of political appointments to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal has skyrocketed, and why that's so alarming.
For the past decade, the Coalition has been accused of stacking the Administrative Appeals Tribunal with former MPs and advisors.
The government has turned the Administrative Appeals Tribunal into a private liberal employment company.
People are concerned about the AAT, as I am, about it being so heavily politicised that it actually lacks the authority that's so necessary for a vital organisation.
Well, there are just 5 days to go until Australians go to the polls.
There's a real problem for this government around deficit of trust, which, you know, most Australians have a healthy scepticism anyway, but this is really landing in their own backyard.
Prime Minister, who promised us at the last election that he would deliver a Federal Integrity Commission during this Parliament. Well, that was more than 1,000 days ago. All we've seen is a draft plan from the government, no legislation.
Lead author of the report, Deb Wilkinson, is an expert in the study of cronyism and is completing her doctorate at the Australian National University. But unfortunately, she's unable to join us today. So to discuss this important research led by our Democracy and Accountability program, I'm delighted to introduce Ben Oquist, Executive Director at the Australia Institute. G'day, Ben.
G'day, Eb. Thanks for having me.
And Head of the Australia Institute's Democracy and Accountability program, Bill Browne. G'day, Bill.
Hi, Ebony.
Bill, I want to start with you. Before we deep dive into the numbers from this research, for anyone who's unfamiliar, what is the Administrative Appeals Tribunal? What does it do? Why is it important?
The Administrative Appeals Tribunal, or AAT, is responsible for conducting merits reviews of government decisions. So for particular decisions, it has to be specified in legislation, but for particular decisions you can go to the AAT and ask them to reconsider a decision that's been made by a government minister or a government department or agency. Some of the main examples are a child support case or decisions about workers' compensation for Commonwealth employees, veterans' entitlements, and also migration and refugee visas. That gives you a sense of the life-changing decisions that the AAT might be involved in making or remaking, and why you'd really want someone who's got the skills and independence to make their decisions well and hear your case fairly.
Yeah, I've read a little bit about people, for example, who've had their NDIS funding cut ending up in the AAT. So it is those kind of very life-changing decisions that they end up adjudicating. Ben, as we've just said, a lot of important decisions end up at the AAT. What does the Australia Institute's research show has happened to the appointments process over time?
Well, I'm particularly pleased to be here because it's really one of the biggest projects the Australia Institute's taken in some time, this research. It's taken 6 months to do, and it represents the largest and most comprehensive study of the practice of political patronage or cronyism in relation to appointments by a government agency ever conducted in Australia. And in fact, I think it's internationally significant, the report that Deb Wilkinson, who you mentioned, put together with the assistance of Liz Morrison and with Bill as the head of the Democracy and Accountability Program. It's a detailed deep dive that has investigated every single appointment made to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, or AAT as we're shorthanding it, since 1996. Almost 1,000 appointments in total, 974, and it reveals the proportion of political appointments to the AAT has skyrocketed from 5 to 6% under Howard and Rudd and Gillard to almost 3 appointments across the Abbott, Turnbull, Morrison government, and 2 in every 5 appointments, 40% under the current Morrison government from 2019 to 2022.
So it's gone from 6% way back in the day when it all kicked off, and then rose over time to about 30% over the term of the total coalition government. But under this most recent administration, under Morrison, it's up to 40% now, 4 in 10.
Yeah, if 6 in 100 under John Howard, and 40% now under Scott Morrison. And that's significant because it's probably higher. When assessing what's a political appointee, Deb and the researchers have cast a very narrow definition, and it's if you've worked for an MP, you are an MP, you're a party official, a pre-selection candidate, or worked for a narrowly defined party-affiliated organisation. That's not just any organisation. For example, if you're just a party member, or you worked in the public service, or you're a consultant to the party, you're not classified as a political appointment. So it's a conservative definition. So in a way, the patronage or the cronyism, the political patronage or the cronyism, is likely to be worse. But the data tells the story. That increase from where it was under John Howard to where it is today is just enormous.
Yeah, it's just a massive jump. And as you said, the research is pretty conservative in what it defines as a political appointee. Bill, what kind of qualifications are appointments to the AAT supposed to have? And, I mean, could we say that these political appointees are there on merit?
The rules provide that you're meant to have legal qualifications or other qualifications that would qualify you to do the job, not specified in a great lot of detail. What we see is that the political appointees follow a very different pattern to the non-political appointees. As an example, 53% of political appointees that are members have no legal qualifications, almost double the 26% of non-political appointees that are members that have no legal qualifications. The reality is that the decisions that the AAT makes have to be legally valid. They have to make the legally correct decision if there's only one legally correct decision that they can make. So you absolutely want deep skills, particularly legal skills, to be a member of the AAT. It gets even more extreme as a disparity when you look at senior members and above, where 26% of political appointees had no legal qualifications and just 1% of non-political appointees had no legal qualifications.
And you might remember last month when we were just days out from the election being called, the Attorney General Michaelia Cash announced 19 new appointments to the tribunal, including former West Australian and New South Wales Liberal ministers.
I mean, I challenge you to point out which one of those 19 new appointments are not qualified.
Well, let's go through that if you want to raise that. If you raise that issue.
The 19 new appointments, Senator Carr, are legally qualified, including 8 barristers. I would argue that having those legally qualified people is an asset to the AAT.
So there's one issue there, you're saying, with the qualifications that you have, and there's a higher proportion that don't necessarily have a legal background. Can you tell me a little bit more about why that issue of seniority is significant?
Senior members of the AAT are expected to take something of a leadership and mentoring role in the organisation. So as well as taking on hearings themselves and ideally taking on some of the more difficult or legally nuanced hearings, they're also expected to provide support for their fellow members. And that's why it's particularly important that senior members are well qualified and independent, have a lot of expertise behind them.
It's the really important point. They also, they deal with the complicated cases. They provide the leadership, as Bill said. And it's the explosion, in one sense, it's the explosion in the political appointments without legal qualification at the senior level that really is potentially the most worrying. There really weren't senior people appointed at the AAT without legal qualifications in the past. It's only recently that that's really happened at all. And I mean, you go back a step, the AAT is basically an amalgamation of previously existing bodies. We've had a refugee tribunal and a migration tribunal, and it's a social security affairs tribunal. And they used to often have multiple panellists deciding your case. But really under the AAT and the consolidation that's happened, it's often just one person who hears your case.
So previously you might have had a panel with a legal expert and maybe a social worker or someone from Centrelink, or, like you'd have a range of people hearing your case.
And therefore, potentially it's okay that somebody on there didn't have legal experience because you'd have somebody who did. But now you might only be heard by one person, so it's really important that they have that legal experience. And the fact that they might not, and the fact that so many are now political appointees, really amounts to a complete radical reshaping of one of the key judicial or quasi-judicial oversight bodies in our legal and democratic infrastructure. And the power of the research is that this, in one way, has been a creeping transition, but it's also happened suddenly because the proportion is now so high. We're really seeing a fundamental restructure of what should be an independent oversight body and what needs to be seen as an independent oversight body, and that's just not happening.
And presumably, Ben, it's not necessarily an issue that we want to exclude all, parliamentarians from ever serving on the AAT. I can think maybe a former Attorney General or something like that, might make the cut. But what you're saying there is the balance is just totally out of whack.
I think it's a good point, Eb, because there is a role for former politicians, former advisors to have work in the public sector, that bringing some knowledge of political experiences can be a good thing. It's not that all politicians or all former advisors should be excluded. It's the explosion in the number of them. And of course, you cite a good hypothetical example, but it's a real one. There has been a former State Attorney General appointed to the AAT, and that would fit our definition of political appointment, but they had good legal experience. And of course, there always will be some role, whether it should be 5%, 6%, 7%, 2%, 1%, who knows. But what shouldn't have happened is it going from 5 to 40 and the explosion of people without legal qualification, and particularly under that political appointment category.
What about Prue Goward, the former New South Wales minister? What are her specific qualifications?
Well, in relation to Prue Goward, again, I think for her, her qualifications stand for herself, and in particular as someone who from 2001 to 2007 was incredibly well known across Australia. Ms. Goward, eminently qualified. Her record stands.
Qualified for what?
Senator Carr, we're going to just stop this question.
Bill, I guess that takes us to how can we fix it? I know the report makes some recommendations there. What can be done now that we're at the level of appointments that we currently see?
The first step is we need an independent review of the AAT that can really get to the bottom of these issues. There's a Senate review that's ongoing. It's made an interim report, and some of the submissions that have already turned up from that process have been really troubling for the image of the AAT as an independent body with integrity and the expertise that it needs to do its job. So an inquiry that's independent of government, that also has the power to compel witnesses to give evidence, is really needed to get to the bottom of what's happening. But beyond that, we recommend a spill of the positions in the AAT, and for those appointments and reappointments to be made again, but with strict rules for independence and legal qualifications in place. For those decisions to be made by an independent body that's at arm's length, not just of the government, but of the departments as well, since the AAT often reconsiders decision-making at the departmental level. There's also room, Ben mentioned that it's now typically one member having a hearing, and therefore legal qualifications are particularly important. In fact, we recommend should exist at a minimum. But you could remake the tribunal so that it did go back to multi-member hearings, and then there would be room for non-legal qualifications to be considered as well, as long as you also had the legal expertise in the room.
Is it appropriate Fiona Meagher, the daughter of former High Court Judge Ian Callanan, was promoted at the Administrative Appeals Tribunal without any interview or process while Mr Callanan was conducting a review of the organisation? Is it true Mr Callanan called you in late 2020 advocating for his daughter to be appointed to a $500,000 Deputy President role?
Look, I'm not aware of the matters that you're referring to, and I'm not aware of the call you're referring to, so I can't really offer much comment.
Bill's being polite about the current Senate inquiry that's gone in, and some of the revelations in there have been embarrassing for the AAT and its image and reputation. There has been inquiries. There's a previous Callanan inquiry that reported in 2019 that went to this issue of needing to have legal qualifications. That hasn't been taken up. There were some reforms to the processes of appointments, the protocols that happened following that. But they left the minister with complete discretionary powers in the end about who they might appoint with cabinet authority. That inquiry is ongoing. It's made some good recommendations, but it hasn't issued its final report, this Senate inquiry now. But there have been some bombshell submissions made to that Senate inquiry that really haven't had much of a public airing. Some submissions by former staff, current staff, former serving AAT members paint a really worrying picture. And I'll just read you a couple of the concerns from those submissions made to that AAT inquiry.
Please.
These are from people who've worked there or who even are working there, made anonymously but truthfully. The concerns raised in the submission about the capacity of appointees included the lack of basic office-based employment skills possessed by some members of the tribunal, such as the ability to type, save a document to Microsoft Word, or access resources on the internet, the lack of legal skills of some members and the time wasted in having to repeatedly assist them, the poor attitude of some members towards their role and the lack of interest in ensuring the hearings are conducted in a procedurally fair manner and that lawfully sound decisions are made, the lack of a merit-based culture within the organisation and the impact this is having on the morale of the staff. It just goes on. I mean, these submissions some of them only came to light just on the eve of the election, but they kind of underscore what the data in this report is showing, that it's leading to a kind of a fundamental weakening or gutting of the authority, the strength, the rigour of what's a really important decision-making body that affects people's lives.
Yeah, I remember listening to Rick Morton talking about one of his stories for the Saturday paper on their podcast and talking about a person whose NDIS funding had been cut in half. They were a terminal patient and died before they could get a ruling, and it was a genetic condition that also affected his younger brother, and then the younger brothers had to go back to the start to try and appeal his funding through the AAT. Like, it just is, as you said, it's kind of life and death decisions in some cases. Bill, are there any other recommendations that you want to let people know about for how we might be able to fix this?
Putting the political appointments in context, one of our recommendations is that people need to resign their membership of a political party before joining the AAT and not rejoin while they're members of the AAT. We thought that was important mostly for symbolic reasons, to emphasise that a body that's been politicised should be independent and free from party interference. Along with that, we'd like to see appointments to the AAT have serious, detailed biographical information and their qualifications made public, so that it's clear that they are being appointed on merit under this new system. We also recommend a bit of arm's length for appointees. So you can be a former member of parliament, a former advisor, and so on, but to have a period of time in between so that you're not immediately moving out of a political role and into the AAT, where you might be making decisions about cases that occurred during your time in office or linked to the government. So getting a bit of arm's length in the AAT kind of rounds off our recommendations.
I'm Zoe Daniel. I'm Allegra Spender. I'm Sophie Scomps.
My name's Kylie Ting.
And I'm your community-backed
Independent
candidate.
I'm really frustrated with the current government in terms of climate, in terms of integrity, in terms of the economy.
And I felt very strongly that the nation needs this. They're calling for it. 9 in 10 Australians want an integrity commission.
Ben, I know the issue of integrity has been a big one this election, and we know that the electorate has lost a lot of trust in politics and government. A lot of that has focused around, in particular, the need for a corruption watchdog, but how much do issues like this, like the political stacking of the AAT, really contribute to that overall loss of trust, and how important is it that we don't just let this slide and become the new way things are done?
That's why I think this report is so important and so powerful, because it puts in place the data in a rigorous way. As we said, looked at, almost 1,000 individual appointments going back to 1996 to put the data to the vibe. And there has been a feeling through, stories that you've just told of other reporting of unfair decisions going on at the AAT. You hear about individual appointments sounding like they're political and not merit-based. It's all leading to a kind of vibe that something's going wrong in what is a key part of our legal and democratic architecture, the AAT.
If you feel like you're getting screwed by the government, like the AAT is where you end up to try and fix it.
Yeah, so there's a vibe going on that is bad. But this report kind of proves it in a systematic and detailed way. And that's why I'm so proud of the work that Deb Wilkinson and Liz and Bill have done here, because it puts a hard piece of data around what is a vibe about a threat to our democracy. And in a way, that's why the first recommendation is so important, is that the report says to how to fix it, is we need a root and branch inquiry into what's gone wrong and how these political appointments are being made to overturn it. We need to spill all the positions and start again, because you're right, Eb, there has been a deterioration, a loss of faith in trust in politics that's leading to loss of faith and trust in democracy, that's leading to a loss of faith in government itself. And we've seen where that leads around the world. I mean, democracy can't be taken for granted. Now, that sounds grandiose in some sense, but ultimately, unless the trend away from trust in democracy is arrested, that's where you end up. And integrity is at front and centre of the election, largely because of the need for a federal ICAC. But I think underneath that, the push for a federal ICAC comes from a loss of faith in institutions like the AAT as well.
And it strikes me, Ben, that partly that loss is that feeling that politicians are only in it for themselves or for their mates, and this really just feeds directly into that, doesn't it?
Yeah, such a shame, because we need politicians.
Yeah.
And democracy can't work without politicians or politics. But if the vibe continues that they're just in it for themselves or just looking after their mates, it loses people lose faith not just in politicians but democracy. And we need to find ways of actually championing politicians and politics, and this does the exact opposite. And going back to where we started, it's a narrow definition that Deb has come up with for looking at what is a political appointee. Undoubtedly, there are people that are not captured in this data who are friends or mates of the politicians being appointed. We didn't include them as political appointee, even though some of them we knew were friends or acquaintances. So the data in this report is conservative, but it doesn't shine a full light on that worrying trend of political patronage and cronyism, which is not, of course, just bad in itself, but is a real threat to democracy.
Thank you so much, Bill and Ben. This episode was recorded on Tuesday the 17th of May, and things may have changed since recording. You can visit australiainstitute.org.au for all our latest research, including this report, and we're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is Ebony_Bennett with a _N_T. Ben Oquist is at Ben Oquist, and Bill Browne is at Browne with an E, Browne90. This episode was produced by Jennifer Macy, and you can find her at Jennifer Macy, with additional editing by Louise Osborne. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. Stay safe out there, and thanks for listening.